Today, I want to challenge you to rethink church. If you're an American Christian, this is probably how church works for you. You get up, you go to a building, you listen to a sermon, you sort of check it off your box, and then you go home and we'll do it again. It's kind of like, for a lot of people, it's kind of like going to a movie. You're consuming a product, right? The product is a sermon, and Christians today, they go to consume a product. And so if they don't like the product, they go find another church, a church where they like the product a little bit better. It's kind of like going to a movie. You go to a movie, I do this with my wife. I go to a movie, we talk about whether we like the movie or not on the way home, and that's it. It doesn't really impact our lives. That's pretty much what it boils down to. And for so many Christians today, now I know this isn't true for everybody, but for so many Christians today, that's what church boils down to, is listening to a sermon. But I want to challenge you today that is not what Jesus envisioned. Jesus envisioned that church would be more than a sermon. Now, I'm not trying to throw sermons under the bus. I preach for a living, so I think it's great that we have good teachers, biblical teachers. That's all great. But what I want to challenge you to consider is that church is more than that, and that's what Jesus thought too. Jesus envisioned a church that actually makes a difference in the world. That's what he wanted. After all, church is not a building. That's what we think about. Church is a people. So if you're a Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus, you're a part of his church, and he envisioned that you would make a difference in the world. And I think Matthew chapter 9 is a perfect example of this. In Matthew 9, earlier in the chapter, Jesus is out there preaching a sermon to the crowds. So it probably looks a lot like a megachurch, right? We've got crowds gathered to hear a great teacher. And Jesus was, of course, the greatest teacher. He preaches the sermon, and then he says this. In verse 36, it says that when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And he said to his disciples, "The harvest is great, but the workers are few." And here's what I think Jesus was experiencing at that moment 2,000 years ago, because I've experienced this so many times as a preacher. I've been up there, I've preached a sermon. Sometimes I could see that it hit this person over here or this person over here. I see tears in somebody's eyes, and I can tell that this sermon is impacting them. And maybe that's exactly how Jesus felt. He preaches this sermon, and he can see thousands of people, and he can tell that the sermon has impacted them. But then in his heart, he had compassion on those people because he understood that the sermon wouldn't be enough for them. As great as the sermon was, that the sermon wouldn't be enough for them. There have been many times where I've preached a sermon, and afterward I feel kind of empty because I know that people are going to walk away from there having heard a sermon and needing something a little bit more. Because, be honest, sermons can go in one ear and out the other. Or maybe you've been sitting there listening to a message and it's really impacted you, but by the time you finish up with lunch later on in the afternoon, you've already forgotten about the sermon. Or Monday morning comes along and now you're back to the grind and you forget about the sermon. And so the reality is Jesus envisioned something more than just people coming to church, checking the box, listening to a sermon, going home, coming back next week. It's not supposed to just be all about one pastor, one teacher giving a sermon, and everyone watches that person do ministry. The reality is that Jesus wants to send out regular people to make an impact, not just pastors. Jesus is a master strategist. When he came to the earth, he spent the bulk of his 3 years discipling a dozen people, and then those dozen people he wanted to send out to impact the world. He knew that his sermons, and I'm sure if he had YouTube 2,000 years ago, they would have been posted all over YouTube and really popular on YouTube or on Netflix or whatever else, right? But he knew that those sermons just in and of themselves wouldn't be enough. He wanted to send out regular people to help regular people, and that's why he picked fishermen. Think about what he did when he called the initial disciples. Jesus called out to them and he said, "Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people." Notice Jesus didn't say to those fishermen, "Come follow me and you can hear a lot of great sermons. Come follow me and you'll get a front row seat to this consumer Christian experience. No, he said, no, come follow me, you regular people. They're fishermen, not Pharisees, regular people. They weren't educated. They weren't seminarians. They didn't know the Bible, right? He said, you come follow me and I'm going to show you how to impact the world, because Jesus has always been in the business of impacting the world through regular people. And that's why, back to the church sermon experience, church is so much more than a sermon. It breaks his heart to see churches where people come and listen to a sermon and go, come and listen to a sermon and go. He wants to connect people, Christians, to other people. He wants to connect real live human beings. He called it fishing for people. Some churches call it discipling people. We like to call it mentoring people because that's a more normal term in today's world. He wants people to come, hear a great sermon, but he wants them to connect them to someone who can walk with them and help them unpack that incredible truth that they just heard in that sermon. And that's why back in Matthew chapter 9, after his heart was broken for the people and he turned to the disciples, and he ended up saying to them, pray to the Lord of the harvest that he would send out laborers into the field. And then in the next chapter, Jesus actually sent out those fishermen, those regular fishermen, to go make disciples. And the reality is, you don't have to feel qualified to be obedient to Jesus. So if Jesus envisioned something more for the church than you just going and consuming a sermon, he wants you to get in the game, just like the fishermen 2,000 years ago. He wants you to sit there and look out and say, who can I walk with to help them unpack truth? So many people, when they hear that, they say, whoa, I don't think you're talking about me. I don't think Jesus would use someone like me. I don't have a degree. My pastor's the one that has a degree. But remember, Jesus wants to connect regular people with regular people. We call that mentoring. We've actually created the resources at PursueGOD.org to empower just that. We want to empower parents to help their kids. Instead of just bringing your kids to church and dropping them off at kids' church, we want to give you the tools to disciple your kids at home, parents. We want to help men mentor men. And we've got tools for that. We want to help women walk with women, because that's what Jesus wanted in Matthew 9. Not just people coming and listening to a sermon and going home, but he wanted to connect regular people with regular people. And our tools help you do that. You don't have to feel qualified. Jesus called you to it. In Matthew 28, he said, go make disciples. You know that if you're a follower of Jesus, that means you. He wants you to go help someone make disciples. Church is so much more than a sermon. I hope that you view it like Jesus did. I hope you realize that, wait a second, Jesus wants me in the game. So next time you're at church listening to a sermon, I want you to look around at the people who are impacted by the sermon. And I want you to think, could I shepherd that person? Could I offer to walk alongside that person and help that person through different life topics and faith topics? The Pursue God tools will equip you to do it. Jesus called you to do it. You don't have to feel qualified to answer the call for Jesus. Now, we sat down in the studio and we talked to a few regular people who are doing this, and I want to end this video by showing you what they had to say about it. So for you guys, did you feel, when you first started discipling people, did you feel qualified?
No. Not even close. It's uncomfortable.
Right.
It makes you feel like you're in a position of authority when you might not feel like you have any authority. Even though really it's you just walking with someone and growing in your pursuit of God.
And it's interesting you say that, because in Matthew 28, Jesus says, all authority has been given to me. Mm-hmm. Therefore, go do this. So the authority we have is derived from Jesus. Mm-hmm. Jesus is saying, I'm the boss, and I'm telling you to go do it, even if you don't feel qualified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not of our own authority.
Right.
That's what's scary, is because sometimes you feel like it is, but it's really God's authority, and so then you know you can do it. That's
right. JD, did you feel qualified when you first started discipling?
No, not at all. And we talked a lot about, it's okay to get in and just start a conversation and work through it. It's
right. And how many guys are you doing that with now on a regular basis?
On a regular basis, 2 guys.
Yeah.
But there's a couple more that are hit or miss.
Yeah. And 10 years ago, your Christian life was just all boiled down to, more than this, but you went to church and you listened to sermons.
It was honestly probably just me.
Right.
It wasn't even, I sent my kids to a Christian school so that they could get the word that way.
Wow.
And I didn't even have to feel the obligation to teach them. And
Yeah.
so I was just looking at myself.
Yeah. And church became this consumeristic thing, which is, I think, what happens to so many Christians. That's why we're doing this topic. Crystal, last word from you. Did you feel qualified when you started discipling?
No, I did not. And I'm an introvert, so it was fairly uncomfortable for me. But the first lady I mentored, we met for coffee a couple times, and then we decided to do the Pursue God resources. And what worked for us was over the phone every other week, just so it was fresh on our minds. We actually would put it on mute, watch the video at the same time over the phone.
Really?
On our own laptops, and then talk about it on the phone. And that worked really well. And so that was how that one started. And I think every mentoring relationship has to be individualized, depending on people's schedules and location of where they live and everything like that. But it definitely helped to have the Pursue God resources. And one thing I think that's really important for people to know is that you don't have to have all the answers. So I know new believers who are actually mentoring people who have been believers for a long time.
Wow, that's cool.
And I think that, you don't have to feel like I have to know all the answers, because the answers are out there. You just might have them not at the moment, but it's always something you can, find out.